You think you know awkward? Try sitting across from your ex while they're being paid to help you figure out your life. I didn't plan it that way. I'd been looking for a new therapist after my old one retired, and the clinic my insurance covered had a short list. I skimmed through profiles online and picked a name that looked vaguely familiar. It wasn't until the first appointment, when I walked into that tiny office with the mismatched chairs, that it hit me: Evan. Same sandy hair, same habit of tapping his pen when he was thinking. We dated in our mid-20s, back when both of us were still figuring out what we wanted from our careers and each other. The breakup hadn't been explosive, just a slow drift until one of us finally said, "I think we're done." Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but there's a strange social gravity in those moments. You tell yourself it's fine, that you're both adults now. Besides, we were in Austin, where running into people from your past is basically a local pastime. Evan smiled like it was no big deal, and I convinced myself it wasn't. Looking back, I should have noticed the subtle tilt in the room that day. Therapy's supposed to be about you, but Evan had this way of steering the conversation into old territory. Things we disagreed on years ago, reinterpreted now through his professional insight. It wasn't hostile, just layered. When you've shared history with someone, every question carries baggage. By the end of that first session, I told myself it was manageable. Professional boundaries, right? We'd both moved on. At least, that's what I believed walking back to my car in the humid Texas air. I had no idea how tangled it would get from there. The first few weeks weren't disastrous. If anything, there was a weird comfort in talking to someone who already knew chunks of my backstory. I didn't have to explain the basic outline of my childhood or why I'd moved to Austin. Evan remembered those details, which meant we could get to the good stuff faster. That was the sales pitch I gave myself anyway. But you start to notice when someone leans on old versions of you. Evan would say things like, "You've always had trouble setting boundaries," or, "You were like this when we dated." It was jarring. Therapists are supposed to observe patterns, sure, but not through the lens of their own personal experiences with you. It's like getting a job review from someone who used to be your roommate. They remember the dishes you didn't wash more than the work you actually did. At first, I'd laugh it off. You want to believe they're just drawing connections to help you. But sometimes his connections felt like judgments. And when you're sitting in that chair, you're in a vulnerable spot. The power balance is already tilted toward the person holding the notepad. Outside of sessions, I started catching myself replaying old conversations from when we were together, arguments about money, how often we went out, whether I was too accommodating with friends. Things I thought I'd put to bed years ago suddenly had a spotlight on them again. And because this was therapy, I kept telling myself that maybe this discomfort was part of the process. That's the tricky part about trust. You can confuse discomfort for progress, especially when you've been trained, professionally, in my case, to believe in the value of pushing through it. I didn't yet see that there's a difference between productive discomfort and the kind that just reopens old wounds. By the fourth session, the lines were starting to blur in ways I couldn't ignore. Evan began referencing people from our mutual past, friends we'd hung out with, even a couple we used to double date. He dropped their names casually, as if they were just harmless points of context. But each mention pulled me back into a network of memories I hadn't signed up to revisit. One afternoon, he brought up a weekend trip we'd taken years ago. It wasn't even related to what I was talking about. I'd been describing a current work issue, and somehow it turned into him recalling how I handled stress poorly back then. I remember feeling my jaw tighten, wondering if this was about therapy or about him settling old accounts. I kept thinking, maybe I'm overreacting. That's the self-doubt that creeps in when someone holds both personal history and professional authority over you. You question your own read on the situation, because confronting it feels messy. Who wants to be the person accusing their therapist of bias, especially when that therapist used to be in your bed? My coping mechanism became compartmentalization. I told myself I'd take what was useful from our sessions and ignore the rest. That sounded mature in theory. In practice, it meant I was constantly filtering his words through two lenses, one for what he meant as a therapist, and one for what he might still mean as an ex. The real trouble started when his advice began to shape my decisions outside of the office. It wasn't just about processing feelings anymore. His suggestions carried the weight of someone who once had a vote in my life. And without realizing it, I was letting him have that vote again. It showed up first in small choices. I'd mention a conflict at work, and Evan would suggest a course of action, something bolder than I'd usually attempt. I followed it, partly because it sounded reasonable, partly because I didn't want to seem resistant. The thing is, boldness isn't inherently bad, but his version of it felt familiar. It was the same push he used to give me when we were dating, the "stop overthinking and just do it" pep talk that sometimes led to great results, and sometimes to complete disasters. One suggestion blew up in my face. I confronted a colleague over what I thought was a pattern of undermining me, just like Evan had advised. The colleague, blindsided, escalated it to our manager, and suddenly I was in HR explaining myself. Sitting in that office, I couldn't shake the thought, this isn't how I operate. I'm measured. I gather information before I act. That wasn't my voice in that confrontation, it was his. When I brought up the fallout in our next session, Evan didn't exactly apologize. He reframed it as a learning experience, pointing out that I'd finally taken initiative. That might have worked on someone else, but I could hear the undertone, like he was grading me on some unspoken scale he'd been keeping since we dated. I started leaving our sessions feeling unsettled, not lighter. And it wasn't just the professional stakes anymore. His presence was starting to color how I saw myself. The version of me that Evan believed in, decisive, direct, a little reckless, wasn't exactly wrong, but it wasn't complete. And in therapy, incomplete can be dangerous. That's when I began to wonder if I was in the wrong room entirely. The breaking point didn't come from some dramatic blowout. It crept in through a single, ordinary Tuesday. I'd been talking about feeling stretched thin between work, friends, and a volunteer project I'd taken on. Evan leaned back, gave me that look I remembered from our dating days, and said, "You've always overcommitted to things that don't serve you. Remember when you signed up for that half marathon just to impress people?" It was a throwaway example to him, but to me, it was a snapshot of a fight we'd had years ago. Back then, I'd pushed myself through that race as a personal goal. He'd seen it as attention-seeking. Hearing him frame it the same way now, in this context, made my stomach knot. It wasn't therapy, it was a rerun. I spent the rest of the session nodding politely, my mind half elsewhere. That's the thing about moments like this. Once you notice the bleed through, you can't unsee it. Every comment after that carried a dual meaning, one professional and one personal. I realized I was spending more energy decoding him than actually working on myself. Afterward, I sat in my car in the clinic's parking lot, watching people come and go. I thought about how many times I'd told my own clients to trust their instincts when something felt off. It was almost embarrassing how long it had taken me to apply that to my own situation. The truth was, Evan wasn't just an ex who happened to be my therapist. He was still, in subtle ways, playing the role he'd always played in my life, shaping my choices, defining my patterns, telling me who I was. And I was letting him. The idea of starting over with someone new felt exhausting. But staying? That was starting to feel like handing him the keys again. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been slowly slipping backward without realizing it. I pulled out my old journal from when Evan and I were dating, something I hadn't looked at in years. Flipping through the pages, I saw the same themes over and over, me defending my decisions, him challenging them, me second-guessing myself. It wasn't that his opinions were always wrong. It was that they were always louder than mine. Reading those entries was like holding up a mirror to my current sessions. I'd walked into therapy thinking I was seeking clarity, but somehow I'd ended up relearning an old dynamic. It made me question whether I'd actually made progress in the last couple of months, or just become better at justifying his influence. The next week, I tried steering the conversation in a different direction, avoiding topics that might trigger shared history. But even when I stayed in safe territory, like talking about my workload, he still found a way to frame it with echoes from the past. "You've always had trouble delegating," he said at one point. It was subtle, but the always hung there, loaded with years of context. After the session, I walked to my car and sat with the AC blasting, phone in my lap. I pulled up my insurance portal and started scrolling through the list of covered providers. Most were strangers to me, which was the point. My gut was telling me I needed someone who didn't know a single detail about my life before I walked into their office. But even as I searched, I hesitated. Ending therapy isn't like ending a gym membership. You tell yourself you can push through, give it a little more time, see if it gets better. The harder truth was that nothing was going to change unless I did. I went into the following session with a plan, not to confront him, just to observe. I wanted to see if maybe I'd been projecting my own baggage onto him. But the moment I sat down, Evan mentioned a bar we used to go to, tying it to some analogy about finding your comfort zone. It was a harmless comment on the surface, yet it landed like a stone in my stomach. The rest of the hour followed the same pattern. He'd mix in practical advice with these personal callbacks, little reminders that he knew a version of me no one else in my professional life had access to. Maybe that was comforting to some clients. To me, it felt like therapy was happening through a rearview mirror. Driving home, I thought about the ethics classes I'd taken for my own social work license. We'd spent hours discussing boundaries, how even well-meaning overlaps between personal and professional worlds could skew the process. If one of my colleagues told me they were seeing an ex as a therapist, I'd have told them to run in the opposite direction. It wasn't just the discomfort anymore. It was the slow erosion of trust in my own perspective. Every piece of feedback from him came with the shadow of our history, and I couldn't tell where his professional judgment ended and his personal memories began. That's not a question you should have to wrestle with in therapy. By the end of the week, I'd made a short list of other providers. I still hadn't decided how I'd tell Evan, but I knew staying was no longer an option. The only thing left was figuring out how to leave without getting pulled into one more round of him telling me who I was. I booked my next session knowing it would be the last. There was a strange calm in that decision, like I'd already stepped outside the loop we'd been running. Still, I couldn't just ghost my therapist, ex or not. Professional courtesy aside, I wanted to leave on terms that felt like mine, not a conversation he could steer. When I walked in, Evan smiled in that easy, familiar way, like nothing between us had shifted. We went through the motions for the first half, covering my work projects and some recent family news. I kept my answer short, careful not to open any doors that led backward. About 30 minutes in, I said it. "I'm going to transition to a different therapist." I kept my tone even factual. His smile faded for just a second before he nodded. "May I ask why?" he said, voice measured. I'd rehearsed my line. "I think I need someone without personal history with me. It'll help me focus on the work." Clean, neutral, and true. He didn't argue, but I could see the flicker of something, maybe surprise, maybe irritation. He asked if I'd found someone already. I told him I was in the process. The rest of the session stayed polite, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite read. When it ended, We shook hands like colleagues parting ways. Walking out, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because I'd taken back control. Unease because I knew how much of me he still carried in his head. Outside, the Texas sun was sharp and bright. I sat in my car, letting the heat wrap around me, and thought about how endings always feel smaller than you expect, until later, when you realize how much space they free up. The first session with my new therapist was almost disorienting in its simplicity. No knowing smiles, no offhand mentions of old friends, no subtle references to my past choices. She asked questions like she was building a picture from scratch, and every answer felt like it belonged to the present, not some archived version of me. I noticed how different my own voice sounded in that room. I wasn't defending myself against old narratives, or anticipating how she might connect things to a history she didn't know. It was just me, describing my life as it is now. That alone felt like progress. Over the next few weeks, I caught myself comparing her approach to Evan's, not in a bitter way, but as a reminder of what I'd been missing. She didn't push me into decisions that felt unnatural. She didn't frame my tendencies as always or never. Instead, she asked what worked for me, then explored why. The focus stayed where it should have been all along, on my present goals and how to move toward them. There was a part of me that wondered if Evan ever thought about how those sessions had gone from his side. Maybe he believed he'd been helping. Maybe he'd never recognized how much of our shared history had seeped in. But I'd stopped trying to decode his intent. It didn't matter anymore. One afternoon, leaving her office, I realized I'd walked to my car without that familiar tightness in my chest. No replaying conversations, no double meanings to untangle. Just a quiet sense that I was moving forward. And for the first time in months, that felt entirely like my own doing. By the time a month had passed, Evan was just another name in my phone history, one I didn't feel any urge to scroll back to. The new therapist and I had settled into a steady rhythm, and my focus was shifting back to my clients, my work, and the parts of my life that didn't need to be filtered through someone else's old perceptions. I'd catch myself thinking about how easily I'd walked into that first appointment with him, convincing myself it was fine. It wasn't malice that had made it a bad fit. It was the unshakable fact that therapy is about clarity, and history muddies the water. No amount of professionalism can erase the personal lens someone's known you through. In my own practice, I started noticing moments when clients would downplay their instincts, trying to rationalize something that clearly didn't feel right. I gently remind them, you don't owe comfort to a situation that keeps you tangled. It was advice I'd always believed in, but now it carried a weight I'd earned the hard way. Austin is still the kind of city where you run into people from your past without warning. I've seen Evan once since then, passing each other in the produce aisle, a polite nod, no pause. It felt normal. That, more than anything, told me I'd closed that chapter for good. Switching therapists wasn't just about leaving him. It was about stepping out of an old pattern I hadn't realized I was still in. And while I'm not big on tidy life lessons, I know this much. The person guiding you forward should never be the same one who once kept you standing still.